Starfield on the PC. Let's talk about it. So I've been playing Starfield now for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks now since it came out over on the PC. My current system currently rocking an RTX 3090 and an i9 9900K, 8-core 16 threads running at base frequency. So everything is essentially set to stock. And I just want to jump right into it and start this hardware review of Starfield by saying the game isn't necessarily as optimized as you would like to hope a game that's been in development for as long as Starfield has been in, that it has the software underneath the hood to really take advantage of even the hardware that Bethesda has put down for the minimum and required specs to run Starfield. Which, let's start off with the elephant in the room, if you will, and that being Bethesda going in from day one saying, hey, if you want to run Starfield, at a minimum, you have to have a dedicated video card of at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM, right? This is a game that's been in development for 10 plus years now, for quite a while. Yes, Bethesda is using or did use a new engine, the creative engine, to run the game. So maybe there's some kinks under the hood that they have yet to really iron out, at least with Starfield. Now, the game has been patched and updated since I started my hardware review, which is the reason why it took a little while to cook, but there has been a few patches that released that was supposed to introduce a field of view slider and also introduce stability fixes along the way and some other issues or areas that occurred during Quest. I didn't necessarily run into any of these issues, but that does not mean that they don't exist. To start the hardware review off, let's just address the other elephant in the room by saying that yes, this is a Bethesda game. So yes, there were its fair share of bugs.
Look, Admiral, I'm not here to open old wounds.
Old wounds is an interesting turn of phrase, given our past. Listen to me, Commander. I'm not sure why you're here, but whatever it is...
Ran into a lot of bugs, although none of them were like game breaking. They did not prevent me from, pursuing forward or pushing through the storyline or the story quest, but they were slightly immersion breaking. Totally took me out of this experience that Bethesda has painted, that I am this, spacefaring colonialist, if you will, making my way through the universe, planting settlements and sucking up resources on every rock that I could land on. But the bugs did slightly take me out of the experience. If at best, if anything, they were just overall super funny to come across. Given that I am rocking an RTX 3090, previous generation's new hotness or old hotness, however you want to label it, but because I am rocking an RTX 3090, I wanted to test Starfield at higher resolutions, like immediately jumping right into it and saying, you know what, this is a 4K at best card, 2560 by 1440p at best. Like 1080p isn't really an option for me. I'm not a competitive gamer and I don't play fast-paced games. It would have been nice to experience Starfield at a higher resolution or higher frame rate, but essentially what I find myself at 3440 by 1440p was the general sweet spot really for this game was about high settings to medium settings at 3440 by 1440p. And even then, I found myself between like outdoor environments, like on the surface of planets. I found myself hovering somewhere between 55 to 75 FPS, depending on what was going on, say, on that planet. Like were there weather elements going on? Were there a lot of like moving creatures or just alien species moving about on the planet? Like it depended on what was going on that particular planet that impacted my FPS, right? Now, indoors was a slightly different scenario, obviously, given that there's less going on the outside unless the game has to render, unless that your hardware has to accommodate for. But in the inside, I was hovering somewhere between the 70 and 80 FPS mark. This was after the patches, not a huge difference before the patches, but this was after the patches. I was able to kind of hit those numbers. In New Atlantis, I tested initially when we first live streamed the game and when I showed the footage for my preview of this video. But in New Atlantis, we were hovering somewhere between 45 to 50 FPS at day one. And then even after the patches, even now to this day, walking around New Atlantis, it's one of the main, capital cities in the game, and where I find myself going back to constantly sell resources. But we're not going to review the game, just going to talk about how it runs on PC. But moving about in New Atlantis, there wasn't a significant FPS boost or difference after the patch, right? After the patch update, I believe 1.7.29. I still was kind of hitting the same mark in New Atlantis. I mean, New Atlantis seems to be like just taxing on the FPS, causing it to tank in that figure that becomes slightly unplayable for most PC gamers, myself included. I mean, I can get away with maybe 50 to 60. The current panel I use is a 3440 by 1440p ultra wide monitor with a 100 hertz refresh rate. So typically I like to be at or above, or at least hovering around that refresh rate mark, that 100 hertz mark. But in Starfield, I would have to significantly lower my settings or play around with the settings here or there to really be able to get closer to my refresh rate. And even then, I think what would start to happen is I would start to introduce like a reverse bottleneck to where at that resolution, my graphics card should be working as hard as it possibly can to leverage the graphic detail and to leverage the pixels being rendered at that resolution. So that's something I did not want to do. So to find a playable experience, at least at 3440 by 1440p, was about at the high settings mark. FSR2 had little to no impact on FPS. And yes, I imagine that it would run better on AMD hardware, something that I will revisit possibly, especially as the game is properly updated and patched. But with FSR2 actually being on, I mean, I saw more performance with it being turned off and just letting my graphics card do its thing natively and just rendering all those pixels without the help of any AI or frame generation tech or any of that nonsense running on in the background. I'm not totally against FSR and especially FSR3, but I am more along the lines of that general nativity or running your games at their native resolution is the best way to experience them, especially when you're investing in higher end hardware. But FSR2, I mean, had little no impact, so I saw zero reason to turn it on at 3440 by 1440p. And then in terms of how well did the game at least utilize the CPU I was using, the 9900K, which is within specs looking at the minimum and recommended required specification of Starfield, or the recommended CPU class that even Bethesda recommends is somewhere between a Ryzen 5 3600X and an i5 10600K. So at a 9900K, I'm kind of slightly right in between there. At least during the time initially before the patches, CPU utilization was high on all cores. I mean, hyper-threading could be effective performance here, one of those things where hyper performance is actually having a negative effect, but with the game engine constantly trying to leverage all cores and all threads versus single core, which is typically where IPC is the strongest or at its best. Now, I'm not completely surprised here to see CPU utilization so high. Starfield does rely on heavy procedural generation AI tech to, create all these different planets and moons that you explore on the game. So I imagine that the CPU is constantly having to run in the background to calculate those complex maths and run those algorithms. But I expect high CPU utilization here. Like, I really do, because there's so much going on in the background that you don't see, and that's typically where your CPU is being utilized the most, right? Like running those important background tasks in the background and also registering input from your mouse and keyboard, or if you're playing on your controller, it's perfectly fine. I still do. But for the most part, what I needed to essentially rely on with my CPU is having the ability to draw those, procedural generated environments and buildings, right, in a manner that doesn't create like lag or I get strong FPS drops. Because throughout the game, I did experience a few FPS drops, like more often than not, especially in New Atlantis, what I see an FPS drop somewhere between the low 30s and mid 40s. This is also frequent and occurred regularly when I was exploring surface planets, right? Like when I was on the surface of planets, I typically would see the FPS drop here and there between 40 to 50 FPS. Now, why is this important, you say, Lab or Tech with Terrence? Well, it's important because there wasn't much going on during these FPS drops. It's not like I was in a city like New Atlantis when I was on the surface plane. That's quite naturally what I'm talking about, because the FPS drops did occur in New Atlantis. But the point here I'm making is that there wasn't anything going on that should significantly have impacted the FPS to drop as low as they did. Typically, when you're walking on the surface of a planet in Starfield, there isn't much going on. You might have a cluster of alien species moseying on about, or maybe even attacking each other here and there, but for the most part, there isn't a lot of action. There aren't massive amounts of ships dropping down from orbit and landing and like rushing over to you. You're not being bombarded with 2 or more dozens of enemies and alien species all at once. I mean, these FPS drops typically just occurred and happened as I was just making my way across the surface of the planet. It's looking like your best bet would be to probably hover around a CPU of at least 8 cores or more, depending on your budget, but at least an 8-core CPU. Like the 5800X is a great CPU right now at its current price to performance and at its current value offering. Solid 8-core CPU. You want to go with at least an 8-core. That's what I was using, 8 cores, and even at a higher resolution, the CPU shouldn't be as heavily relied on for FPS, but it does still, have an impact or play a part in generating that overall performance. Now, GPU utilization was high as expected, which is a good thing, right? Like even at that high to medium kind of mix, more so high than medium, but even at that typical setting class there, I was at 100% GPU utilization or 99% GPU utilization. I mean, this was consistent across the board, no matter if I was on the surface of a planet, in an interior like a space lab or a research lab, or even just a general structure like a house or a settlement building, something like that. I mean, this was essentially consistent all the time. So no muss, no fuss there. It's good to see, the GPU being properly utilized there. But then making our way over down to memory, I got DDR4 and how much of that was being utilized. Initially, day one, I mean, I was seeing high DDR4 utilization. I was somewhere between 14 to 16 gigabytes, right? Like no matter where I was in the game, memory usage was high. I am at a much higher resolution here, right? We're gaming at 3440 by 1440p. And I don't have anything else open in the background, but that is a lot of memory being used, which screams 32 gigabytes going forward. Going with 32 gigabytes of DDR4 for higher resolution, higher refresh rate gaming is going to be the focus here. I know the game recommends 16 gigabytes, but could you imagine the FPS drops or even the lag I would feel or the stuttering I would experience if GPU utilization was so high and the game or the engine did not have enough memory resources to properly communicate between the CPU and the GPU? You would definitely feel this in the game without a doubt. While I didn't, because on my current content rig, I have 32 gigabytes installed. But I imagine if I didn't, right? And again, at a resolution beyond 1080p, if I didn't, this game would be very much unplayable. It'd be a hot mess, which it's kind of teetering on the edge, but I find myself going back to it. The other area I wanted to address here with Starfield is that SSD requirement. Now, I wonder if this is something we're going to see in more games going forward. Like, will more games require you to have an SSD to install and run the game? Now, you can install Starfield on a hard drive, right? On a mechanical drive. It is just essentially unplayable, like literally unplayable. But here's why that could be the case, at least from Lab's opinion, and that's because the game is riddled with load screens. To be perfectly honest with you, that is the one part of the game that truly breaks all immersion, is when you have to go through a loading screen to get out of your ship, go through a loading screen to sell your stuff, go through a loading screen to get to a loading screen to get out of a loading screen. It's something like that. But no wonder the game requires you to have an SSD. But if you're a long-time viewer here, then you would know that we've been recommended going with an SSD for quite a while now, especially for your primary drive, and only going with a mechanical drive for long-term storage or games you don't play as often or may not run as fast regardless of what the storage format is being installed on. But there are a lot of loading screens. I'm using a 1TB NVMe M.2 as my main gaming SSD on Snow White. My M.2 is pretty fast, right? Like, it's a little dated, but still, it is pretty fast. So I didn't necessarily feel the sting or the weight of the loading screens as much as I felt the loading screens, which were just totally not fun. But again, I can see why Starfield requires you to install and have an SSD. It makes perfect sense. Poor design, at least on the creation engine. I'm not sure what's going on there. But overall, would I recommend Starfield on the PC versus, say, the Xbox Series SX? Because it is, at least at the time of recording this hardware review video, an Xbox exclusive, with Xbox being a division of Microsoft, also available over on the PC. Now, do I recommend Starfield over on the PC if you say you have an Xbox and you're also a PC gamer, or you're even considering wanting to buy an Xbox to play Starfield because maybe you have a PS5 or you have a PC now and you're looking to make some upgrades or potentially upgrade your system altogether to play Starfield, right? Like, are you somewhere along the lines there? Because a few things to keep in mind to run this game, again, requires you to have a graphics card of at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM or more. The higher the better, especially if you want to push your graphics card to a higher resolution. And that's because if you look at the game running at 3440 by 1440p, I mean, we were utilizing somewhere between 5 to 6 gigabytes of VRAM. So a graphics card with at least 6 gigabytes simply won't be enough, especially if you want to dial those settings up, quite possibly even at 1080p, then say a 4 gigabyte graphics card still won't be enough. So considering if you want to play Starfield on the PC versus an Xbox, would I recommend you make that upgrade leap or even buy the game? Is it worthy? Well, quite naturally, yes. Yes, it is. And I'd say because Bethesda has slowly started to release patches and updates to improve on the game, quality of life changes that would help make the game run smoother or just a better overall experience for users either on the Xbox or even on PC. But all right, y'all, that's all I got for this one. It's been your boy Tech with Terrence. If you have any questions about anything discussed throughout the video in this hardware review, please leave them down in the comment section below. If this is your first time to the channel and you're a fan of this kind of content, I do welcome you to subscribe with the notification bell on to catch all future content updates as they slowly drop and roll out. But that's all I got for this one. It's been your boy Tech with Terrence. I do hope to catch you all in the next one. So until then, be easy.